What if a single strike didn't just destroy a target, but quietly invalidated years of defensive planning? What if the most heavily protected site wasn't defeated by overwhelming force, but by timing, patience, and one decision made when failure was still a real possibility? What happened next was not supposed to work according to doctrine, models, and expert assumptions, but it did, and the consequences spread far beyond the explosion itself. The ammunition depot's significance derived not from its physical size or location, but from its function within the larger logistics system that sustained operations across an entire sector. Rather than serving as a simple storage site, the facility operated as a central distribution node through which artillery, ammunition, rockets, and related supplies flowed on a predictable cycle. In modern artillery-centric warfare, combat power is not defined solely by the number of guns deployed at the front, but by the ability to keep those systems supplied at a rate that matches consumption. Units positioned along the front line may appear to be the decisive elements, yet their effectiveness depends almost entirely on rear area infrastructure that enables sustained fire over time. This depot supported that requirement by consolidating large volumes of ammunition and feeding multiple units simultaneously, allowing planners to maintain tempo, synchronize fires, and absorb losses without immediate degradation. Its value, therefore, extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the battlefield. Disrupting such a node does not produce dramatic territorial changes in the short term, but it reshapes the operational environment by narrowing future options. When a systemic node is removed, commanders are forced to adapt plans around uncertainty and resupply, often prioritizing conservation over initiative. Fire missions become more selective, offensive timelines stretch, and the ability to exploit opportunities diminishes. Unlike the loss of a single frontline position, which can sometimes be bypassed or retaken, the destruction of a logistics hub creates effects that are difficult to offset quickly. Replacing the function of a centralized depot requires time, transportation capacity, alternative storage sites, and security, all of which are constrained during active conflict. As a result, the impact is cumulative rather than immediate, influencing decisions made days or weeks later rather than minutes after the strike. This distinction explains why such targets often carry strategic weight, disproportionate to their visibility. The depot mattered because it enabled continuity. Once that continuity was broken, the consequences unfolded quietly across planning tables and fire control schedules, shaping the course of operations without the need for direct confrontation at the front. The timing of the strike appears to have been driven less by calendar symbolism than by a careful assessment of when the target reached peak strategic value. Intelligence indicators suggested that the depot had recently completed a major resupply cycle, concentrating large quantities of ammunition into a limited number of hardened bunkers at the same time. From an operational perspective, this moment represented a temporary but critical condition: maximum storage density. When munitions are dispersed across multiple sites, the effects of a strike tend to be localized and recoverable. When they are consolidated, however, the same level of force can produce disproportionately larger results. High-density storage increases the likelihood that an initial penetration will trigger secondary detonations, allowing physical processes inside the facility to magnify the damage far beyond the point of impact. In this sense, the strike was aimed not just at destroying what was visible, but at exploiting the internal state of the target itself. Acting earlier, before resupply was complete, would likely have reduced the payoff. Acting later would have risked redistribution or increased protective measures. This narrow window forced a trade-off between patience and exposure, as waiting longer can invite detection or changes in defensive posture. Some observers might view this choice as inherently risky, given the uncertainty that accompanies delayed action against a defended target. Others could argue that without waiting for this moment of saturation, the strike would not have justified the cost or the escalation risk involved. The decision reflects a broader tension in modern warfare between acting quickly to seize opportunity and waiting deliberately to ensure decisive effect. There is no single framework that resolves this tension in every case, and different planners may reasonably weigh the risks differently. In this instance, timing transformed a limited strike into a systemic disruption by aligning action with peak vulnerability rather than mere accessibility. How that balance should be judged remains open to interpretation, and readers may differ on whether patience or immediacy offers the more reliable path to success in similar situations. You are invited to share your perspective on this trade-off in the comments. The extensive hardening of the depot was intended to reduce vulnerability, yet it also introduced a form of systemic fragility that became apparent once those defenses were breached. Reinforced concrete bunkers, heavy blast doors, and layered air defenses are designed primarily to prevent penetration from external threats. They are effective at raising the threshold for a successful attack, but they do relatively little to mitigate the consequences if that threshold is crossed. In this case, defensive design emphasized denial rather than resilience. The assumption underlying such fortification is that penetration is unlikely, and therefore internal failure scenarios receive less attention. When that assumption proves false, the very features meant to protect the facility can amplify damage. Hardened structures tend to confine energy, heat, and pressure, which is advantageous against external blasts, but hazardous when detonation occurs inside. Once a warhead penetrated a bunker and ignited stored munitions, the reinforced environment, limited venting, and increased overpressure, accelerating sympathetic detonations in adjacent compartments. Rather than isolating damage, the design enabled it to propagate. Layered defenses created a similar dynamic at the system level. Air defenses reduced the probability of a successful strike but could not guarantee complete interception. When even a small number of attackers reached their targets, the defensive architecture offered little margin for recovery. This illustrates a common challenge in modern military engineering. Systems optimized for prevention often lack mechanisms for graceful degradation. Concentration and hardening improve efficiency and security under normal conditions, but they can produce brittle outcomes under stress. Dispersal, redundancy, and compartmentalization are frequently less efficient and more costly, yet they limit cascading failure when defenses are compromised. The depot's destruction highlights how confidence in fortification can obscure these trade-offs. By focusing on making each bunker harder to penetrate, planners implicitly accepted higher risk if penetration occurred. The result was not simply physical loss, but the rapid collapse of the facility's function as a whole. This outcome underscores that survivability is not defined solely by how difficult a target is to hit, but by how it behaves after it is hit. The selection of a standoff strike profile reflected a deliberate effort to balance effectiveness with risk management. By launching from within Ukrainian airspace, the operation avoided the need for aircraft to penetrate heavily defended zones, significantly reducing exposure to layered air defense systems. This approach limited the likelihood of direct confrontation, while still allowing the strike to reach deep targets of strategic value. In practical terms, standoff weapons extend reach without extending vulnerability, shifting risk from air crews to platforms and munitions that can be employed at distance. This distinction matters in environments where airspace is monitored continuously and response times are short. Rather than challenging air defenses head-on, the strike exploited range and precision to bypass much of the engagement envelope altogether. The choice of long-range cruise missiles also reflected an understanding of escalation dynamics. Crossing borders with manned aircraft carries political and military implications that extend beyond the immediate tactical outcome, including the possibility of capture, loss, or misinterpretation. Launching from within national airspace reduced these variables, keeping the action within a narrower operational frame while still achieving strategic depth. From a planning perspective, this approach preserved flexibility. It allowed decision-makers to apply force selectively without committing additional assets or signaling a broader campaign. At the same time, reliance on standoff weapons imposed constraints. Cruise missiles are finite resources, expensive, and require high-confidence targeting to justify their use. Their employment, therefore, tends to be reserved for moments when potential impact outweighs cost and availability. In this case, the trade-off favored restraint combined with precision. The strike did not seek to overwhelm defenses through volume, nor to demonstrate air superiority through penetration. Instead, it demonstrated how distance can be used as a form of protection, enabling action while limiting escalation pathways. This logic reflects a broader shift in modern operations, where success is increasingly measured by the ability to achieve objectives without expanding the scope of conflict. The timing of the strike suggests that planners accounted for human readiness cycles as carefully as they did technical capabilities. While air defense systems remain operational around the clock, the effectiveness of those systems is shaped by the people who operate them. Periods of heightened alert, such as holidays or anticipated threat windows, tend to produce maximum vigilance and strict adherence to procedures. Over time, however, sustained alertness without engagement becomes difficult to maintain. Once an expected danger period passes without incident, readiness often normalizes as crews return to routine rhythms, staffing levels stabilize, and procedural discipline subtly relaxes. This does not imply negligence or incompetence, but rather reflects well-documented human limits in prolonged, high-alert environments. By delaying action until after the holiday period, the strike appears to have leveraged this normalization effect rather than attempting to defeat defenses at their peak readiness. Importantly, this approach did not require additional force, new technology, or increased risk exposure. Instead, it relied on patience and an understanding of how human performance fluctuates over time. Systems may remain active, radars may continue scanning, and command structures may stay intact, yet the probability of rapid, coordinated response can still decline once elevated alert conditions subside. This dynamic introduces a subtle but meaningful vulnerability that is difficult to address through hardware alone. Increasing automation can reduce reliance on human operators, but most air defense architectures still depend on human decision-making at critical points, particularly in complex or ambiguous situations. Exploiting this factor reflects a shift away from purely technical contestation toward cognitive and organizational considerations. The strike did not attempt to overwhelm defenses through volume or speed. Instead, it sought a moment when the same defenses were marginally less responsive. This distinction matters because it highlights how timing can substitute for force. Rather than escalating by increasing the scale of the attack, planners reduced resistance by acting when resistance was least concentrated. In modern warfare, where surveillance is constant and defensive systems are layered, such temporal advantages can be as decisive as technological superiority. Understanding when to act can be just as important as knowing how to act. And this operation illustrates how human readiness cycles remain a critical variable in otherwise highly technical systems. The performance of air defense systems during the strike illustrates a recurring reality in modern conflict. Effectiveness is rarely absolute. Layered defenses are designed to reduce the probability of successful attack, not to guarantee complete protection under all conditions. In this case, defensive interception appears to have degraded the strike by eliminating at least part of the incoming threat, yet it did not alter the overall outcome. That distinction is critical. Air defenses function as risk management tools, shaping the cost and likelihood of penetration rather than creating an impermeable barrier. When a target's vulnerability depends on internal conditions, such as dense ammunition storage, the defensive requirement shifts. Preventing every penetration becomes essential because even a small number of successful impacts can produce effects disproportionate to the number of weapons that get through. This creates an asymmetry between attacker and defender. The attacker needs only limited success, while the defender must achieve near total denial. Modern air defense systems are highly capable, but they operate under constraints of reaction time, sensor coverage, interceptor availability, and human decision-making. Saturation is not always necessary. Timing, terrain-following profiles, and low-altitude flight can be sufficient to create brief gaps in coverage. Once those gaps exist, the defender's role becomes one of damage limitation rather than prevention. This reality complicates traditional assumptions about protection. Hardened sites, supported by layered defenses, may appear secure in planning models, yet their actual survivability depends on whether defenses can consistently deny penetration across repeated threat axes and conditions. The strike demonstrates that partial success by the defender does not equate to mission failure for the attacker when cascading effects are in play. Even degraded attacks can achieve decisive outcomes if they are aligned with systemic vulnerabilities inside the target. This does not diminish the value of air defense, but it reframes its role. Rather than serving as a guarantee of safety, air defenses buy time, impose costs, and reduce risk. When the consequences of limited penetration are severe, however, mitigation may not be enough to preserve function. In such environments, survivability is shaped by how systems absorb failure, not solely by how often they prevent it. The cost-exchange dynamic of the strike highlights how modern military effectiveness is increasingly measured by the value removed from an adversary's system rather than the volume of force applied. Although the munitions used were expensive and limited in number, their employment was directed at a dependency that concentrated far greater economic and operational value. Ammunition stored in a central depot represents more than inventory. It embodies industrial output, transportation effort, security resources, and future combat potential. When such a node is disrupted, the loss extends beyond what is physically destroyed, affecting the ability to generate combat power over time. In this case, a relatively small investment in precision weapons translated into the removal of a much larger reserve of stored capability, producing an imbalance that favored the attacker. This approach differs fundamentally from attritional models, where success is achieved by gradually degrading opposing forces through repeated engagements. Instead, it seeks efficiency by identifying points where limited inputs can generate outsized systemic effects. Targeting dependencies rather than fielded units allows a strike to bypass the uncertainties of frontline combat and impose costs that are difficult to offset quickly. Replacing lost munitions is not simply a matter of procurement. It requires production capacity, transportation networks, secure storage, and time, all of which are constrained under wartime conditions. As a result, the defender faces not only financial loss, but also reduced flexibility in future planning. The favorable exchange ratio is therefore both material and temporal. It compresses the attacker's cost into a single action, while stretching the defender's recovery across weeks or months. This dynamic also complicates defensive calculations. Protecting every potential dependency to the same degree as frontline forces is rarely feasible, yet leaving such nodes exposed invites disproportionate loss. The strike underscores how precision and selectivity can substitute for scale, particularly when the objective is to disrupt systems rather than defeat formations. In this context, success is defined less by visible destruction and more by how effectively an operation alters the balance of options available to the opposing command. The operational consequences of the strike were not immediately visible on the battlefield, and that delay is central to understanding its significance. Unlike attacks that aim to seize territory or destroy frontline units, this action targeted the conditions that enable sustained operations over time. The loss of a major ammunition depot did not trigger an instant collapse or dramatic shift in lines of contact. Instead, its effects accumulated gradually as planners confronted new constraints. Artillery units dependent on centralized resupply were forced to reassess firing rates, prioritize targets more selectively, and conserve stockpiles in anticipation of uncertain replenishment timelines. These adjustments altered operational tempo in subtle but persistent ways. Planned offensives became harder to sustain, defensive fires more deliberate, and the margin for error narrower. Over days and weeks, such constraints shaped behavior across formations that were never directly attacked. Commanders must allocate limited resources more cautiously, reducing flexibility and limiting the ability to exploit fleeting opportunities. This type of degradation rarely produces a single decisive moment, but it steadily erodes initiative. Importantly, these effects also extend upward into planning and coordination. When ammunition availability becomes uncertain, synchronization across units becomes more complex, and contingency planning grows more conservative. The strike therefore imposed costs not only in material terms, but in cognitive and organizational ones as well. This delayed impact challenges common perceptions of effectiveness that focus on immediate outcomes. Operations aimed at sustainment nodes often appear quiet after execution, yet they continue to influence decisions long after the initial event fades from attention. In that sense, the absence of dramatic frontline change is not evidence of limited success, but a characteristic of this form of warfare. The real measure lies in how future actions are constrained. If you value objective analysis over speculation or commentary, consider following this channel. We focus on how decisions are made and the changes those decisions set in motion. This operation underscores how modern military outcomes are often shaped long before weapons are employed. The decisive factors were preparation, restraint, and an understanding of how complex systems behave under stress. Rather than relying on speed or mass, planners reduced uncertainty, accepted calculated risk, and acted when conditions aligned. The effects of that choice extended well beyond the strike itself, influencing future planning, resource allocation, and operational tempo. In environments where direct confrontation is costly and uncertain, success increasingly depends on recognizing when pressure applied at the right point can alter the broader system. The lesson is not about a single target or weapon, but about how decisions made under constraint can produce consequences that persist long after the immediate action has ended.